the founding fathers of the United States, are they individualists or are they conservatives? So in this particular revolution that founded this country, at the core of which are some fascinating, some powerful ideas, were those founding fathers, were those ideas coming from a place of conservatism, or did they put primary value into the freedom and the power of the individual? What do you think?
There were both. I mean, this is something that's a little bit difficult sometimes for Americans. I mean, even very educated Americans, they talk about the founding fathers as though it's kind of like this collective, entity with a single brain and a single value system. But I think at the time that's not the way not the way any of them saw it. So roughly there's two camps, and they map onto the rationalist versus traditionalist empiricist dichotomy that I proposed earlier. And so on the one hand, you have real revolutionaries like Jefferson and Paine. These are the people who Burke was writing against. These are the people who supported the French Revolution.
So when you say real, so when you say Paine, you're referring to revolutionaries in a bad way. Like, this is a problem.
These are people who will say, history up until now has been, with Descartes, but applied to politics. History up until now has been, just a story of ugliness, foolishness, stupidity, and evil. And if you apply reason, we'll all come to the same conclusions. And Paine writes a book called The Age of Reason, and The Age of Reason is a manifesto for here is the answer to political and moral problems throughout history. We have the answers. And it's in the same school as Rousseau's The Social No, you don't like that?
Yeah. Not at all.
Oh, I thought it was...
I think they're the opposites.
Okay, so let me...
Just to throw in a quick question on Jefferson and Paine, do you think America would exist without those two figures? So, like, how important is spice in the flavor of the dish you're making?
I don't want to try to run the counterfactual. I don't have confidence that I know the answer to the question.
But it's so much fun.
You know what? I'm going to offer something that I think is more fun. More fun than the counterfactual is America had two revolutions, not one. Okay? At first, there is a revolution that is strongly spiced with this kind of rationalism. And then there's a 10-year period after the Declaration of Independence. There's a 10-year period under which America has a constitution, its first constitution, which today they call the Articles of the Confederation. But there's a constitution from 1777. And that constitution is based on, in a lot of ways, on the hottest new ideas. It has, instead of the traditional British system with a division of powers between an executive and a bicameral legislature, instead of that traditional English model, which most of the states had as their governments, instead of that, they say, no, we're going to have one elected body. Okay, and that body, that Congress, it's going to be the executive. It's going to be the legislative. It's going to be everything, and it's going to run as a big committee. These are the ideas of the French Revolution. You get to actually see them implemented in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Constitution, and then later in the National Assembly in France. It's a disaster. The thing doesn't work. It's completely made up. It's not based on any kind. It's neither based on historical experience nor is it based on historical custom, on what people are used to. And what they succeed in creating with this first Constitution is it's wonderfully rational, but it's a complete disaster. It doesn't allow the raising of taxes. It doesn't allow the mustering of troops. It doesn't allow giving orders to soldiers to fight a war. And if that had continued to be the American Constitution, America never would have been an independent country. There, I'm willing to do that counterfactual. What happens during those years, where Washington and Jay and Knox and Hamilton and Morris, there's like this group of conservatives. They're mostly soldiers and lawyers. Other than Washington, most of them are from northern cities. And this group is much more conservative than the than the Tom Paine and Jefferson school. Some historians call them the Nationalist Party. Historically, they give up the word nationalism and they call themselves the Federalists. But they're basically the Nationalist Party. What does that mean? It means, on the one hand, that their goal is to create an independent nation, independent from Britain. But on the other hand, they believe that they already have national legal traditions, the common law, the forms of government that have been imported from Britain, and of course Christianity, which they consider to be part of their inheritance. This Federalist Party is the conservative party. These are people who are extremely close in ideas to Burke. And these are people who wrote the Constitution of the United States, the second Constitution, the second revolution in 1787, when Washington leads the establishment of a new Constitution, which, maybe technically, legally, it wasn't even legal under the old Constitution, but it was democratic. And what it did is it said, we're going to take what we know about English government, what we've learned by applying English government in the States, we're going to create a national government, a unified national government that's going to muster power in its hands, enough power to be able to do things like fighting wars to defend a unified people. Those are conservatives. Now, it's reasonable to say, well, look, there was no king, so how conservative could they be? But I think that's a reasonable question. But don't forget that the American colonies, the English colonies in America, by that point had been around for 150 years. They had written constitutions. They had already adapted, for an entire century, adapted the English Constitution to local conditions where there's no aristocracy and there's no king. I think you can see that as a positive thing. On the other hand, they have slavery. That's an innovation. That's not English. So it's a little bit different from the English Constitution, but those men are conservatives. They make the minimum changes that they need for to the English Constitution, and they largely replicate it, which is why the Jeffersonians hated them so much. They call them apostates. They say they've betrayed equality and liberty and fraternity by adopting an English-style constitution.
So I would imagine, Yaron, you would put emphasis of the success of the key ideas at the founding of this country elsewhere, at the freedom of the individual. So as opposed to the tradition of the British Empire.
I mean, the one thing I agree with Yoram is the fact that, yes, the founding fathers were not a monolith. I mean, they argued, they debated, they disagreed, they wrote against each other. I mean, Jefferson and Adams for decades didn't even speak to each other, though they did make up and had a fascinating relationship afterwards.
You and I are making up too.
There you go.
It's like the founding fathers.
There's massive debate and discussion, but I don't agree with the characterization of Paine and Jefferson. I don't think it's just to call them rationalists, because I don't think they're rationalists. People who've looked at history, at the problems in history, and remember this is the 18th century, and they were coming out of 100 years earlier. Some of the bloodiest wars in all of human history were happening in Europe. Many of them over religion. They'd seen what was going on in France and other countries where people were starving and where kings were frolicking in palaces in spite of that. They were very aware of the relative freedom that the British tradition had given Englishmen. I think they knew that, they understood that. And I think they were building on that. They were taking the observation of the past and trying to come up with a more perfect system.